3 weeks ago, I went to Japan, and what I learned about their food culture absolutely fascinated me. These are people who eat rice every single day at every meal and have some of the best tasting, highest quality food in the world, yet you look around and barely anyone is overweight. Japan consistently has one of the lowest rates of diet-related chronic disease in the entire developed world, and they also have one of the highest life expectancies on the planet. So today, I'm going to share with you the reasons why Japanese people can stay so effortlessly thin and healthy, and more importantly, how you can start adopting the Japanese habits no matter where you live in the world. So the first day I arrived in Japan, I went to a lovely temple and I headed out to breakfast. I found a local Japanese restaurant, and it was so fun to see what they typically ate for breakfast. I got a plate that had miso soup, some pickled vegetables, a rice ball with pickled plum, and some grilled chicken. I think there were also little pieces of tofu that came with it too, and some seaweed. So it was all of these things that I would normally maybe have as more of a lunch, but I had it for breakfast. And what was interesting to me was how many vegetables there were and how savory it was for breakfast. So this is the first habit that you can take with you in a very easy, accessible way. Eat more vegetables. Adding a vegetable forward side instead of thinking about subtracting anything. So whether that's you start having a small soup, like miso soup at your meal, or you add on some pickled vegetables or some edamame, think about how you can add on versus restricting. It was also interesting to see that their traditional breakfast had nothing sweet in it. There was no fruit, there were no pancakes, there were no sugary cereals, none of that. Now, they did have some fun pancake restaurants there too with these big fluffy pancakes, but that's not their traditional breakfast that they have every day. Whereas in the US, that might be where we feed our children Eggo waffles every morning. That might be what is more of our norm versus very out of the ordinary for a typical breakfast in Japan. And the research behind savory breakfast is well known, especially with being able to balance our blood sugar and helping us stay full and satisfied through the day. So when we have something super sweet and sugary first thing in the morning, our blood sugar goes up and then it crashes, and that can lead to more hunger and cravings. Versus when we start with something that's savory and very high in protein, that keeps us satisfied throughout the day, it keeps our blood sugar steady, and it reduces our cravings for those high sugar foods. The second thing that I noticed is that they had rice, noodles, or just some sort of carb at every single meal. And I want to point that out because so often we are blaming carbs here. We are saying that the reason that we are gaining weight and that we have all these health problems is because we're eating too many carbs. We're eating too much bread and pasta and rice. But that's not really true. The reason why most people start overeating and gaining weight is a combination of both what they put in our food in the US that's processed and our mindset around food. The presence of diet culture around us that trains us to think about foods in extremes of all or nothing. We're either having the salad with no dressing and just plain chicken, or we're going all out and we're ordering the pizza and the french fries and having a pint of ice cream that night. That's how we learn to think about food here in the US, and that's not the case there. But the average American consumes significantly more ultra-processed food than the average Japanese person. Some estimates suggest ultra-processed foods make up around 60% of the American diet, but in Japan, that number is drastically lower, and the ingredients in their everyday staples are far simpler. If you look at a bag of chips there, it's not the same as the bag of Doritos we have here in the US. All of these additional ingredients and the overconsumption of overprocessed foods can really confuse our body. And I have a couple of episodes on this that go more in depth on the podcast about how processed foods impact our body and can lead us to craving and binge eating more. But think about how they view carbs then. In Japan, rice is just rice. It doesn't have this morality attached to it where it's good or bad or it's a cheat meal. It's just a random Tuesday that they're eating rice. And that neutrality around food is something that most of my clients have never experienced, and is actually one of the main things that we work on inside the Confident Eater program. I teach you how to look at foods as factually what they are. Some foods truly do have an effect on our body, and we want to be aware of that. But that doesn't mean that they're bad or we're being a bad person for having them. When we take away that morality, it becomes easy to say no thanks to it, or to say, I do want some chocolate cake in amounts that feel good to me, and we can make that decision. If carbs themselves were truly the problem, every person in Japan would be overweight, and that is very much not the case. And they are having white rice, which we are taught is a big no-no by some diets and some measures, when in reality, it is a very healthy part of a normal balanced diet that can help with satisfaction and energy levels and keeping us full and satisfied throughout the day. The next thing that I noticed in Japan is that healthy foods are very accessible and affordable. They have more convenience stores there than fast food stores. And it's reversed in the US. We have a lot more fast food stores than convenience stores. But what's important too is how their convenience stores are structured. structured. So they have lots of these 7-Elevens everywhere, but these 7-Elevens are much different than American 7-Elevens. If you think about the American 7-Eleven, there's nothing in there that you would consider healthy by any means. We typically don't have fresh fruits and vegetables in abundance in a 7-Eleven, but they have 7-Elevens there. And I actually did some research on this because I was curious. Their 7-Eleven is, even though it's the same brand name, it's run by an entirely different kind of company. It's still 7-Eleven at the higher level, but there's a Japanese branch of it that controls the Japanese food, and it's much different than the ones we have in the US. And I would walk into a 7-Eleven. These are on like every corner. You cannot walk a couple blocks without running into a 7-Eleven. And inside of them, it shocked me what types of food they had. There was grilled chicken and fresh vegetable cups with cabbage and jicama and delicious cucumber and carrot sticks that were fresh. They had this yummy sesame dressing that you could dip in. They had fresh cut strawberries. And if you know anything about strawberries, you'll know that when you cut them, they don't last for very long and stay fresh. So what that means is that those strawberries were probably fresh from a day or two ago. They did not sit in the 7-Eleven for months on end like most of our food typically does here in the US. They have standards where these convenience stores are getting new deliveries of food multiple times throughout the day to make sure you continually get the freshest, healthiest food available. Now, a lot of this is because their culture just really values high quality food. They as a culture will not eat something if it doesn't taste good, if it isn't really healthy for them. They value the ingredients and having a high standard for that. So because of that, their government also makes sure that healthy food is affordable and that there's a lot of access to it and that it's not just for the rich people, like sometimes it feels like it is in the US, but really everyone can have it. Now, I know this one is a little bit harder to take into our day-to-day life because we can't necessarily make healthy food more accessible or affordable, but what we can do is by starting to prep food for ourselves for the week and having quick, easy options like grilled chicken ready to go. Yes, I know it takes more work on our part, and that's one of the frustrating things about sometimes living in a place that doesn't make healthy eating as easy and as accessible as we want it to be, but we can decide that that's something that we value and spend time on Sunday making sure that we do things like make our proteins at home and cook up a fresh batch of rice or quinoa, grill some vegetables at home so we have them ready for the week. And the truth is, when you look at it, processed foods are actually really expensive when you start adding up all the unnecessary snacks you're buying and calories you're consuming that you don't really need. Plus, you want to be someone who values their health, and our money is the number one way that we can see what we value in life and what's really important to us. So look, where do I want my dollar to go? And one reframe that can help here is, instead of thinking eating healthy is expensive, try asking yourself, what am I currently spending on food that isn't making me feel good? Because that math often surprises people when they add up the takeout and the fast food and those late night ice cream binges. That adds up financially. And so it might not be as expensive as you realize to start having more of these whole foods prepared ahead of time for yourself and really choosing the things that make you feel your best. Now, this was a really interesting rule that I found shocking. In Japan, there are signs posted everywhere that you are not allowed to be walking and eating your food. You must be sitting down. Even in the to-go food stands where you get your food in just like a little to-go container, you weren't allowed to eat that food standing in the store or outside of the store on the street. You had to go find somewhere to sit down, and there wasn't very many places around there that you could sit. This is the culture that they've created, that eating is an event. You want to be sitting down, slowing down, and they consider it rude and disrespectful and not very sanitary to be eating while you're walking, which is kind of true. So at times this was a bit inconvenient when you wanted to eat something and you're out and about and you're touristing around and you just wanted to eat a sandwich real quick on the go. I still did it sometimes, but it did really make me think how much I had been trained as an American to be go, go, go with food and to pack my schedule full of activities when really eating can be a big activity. And it's something we should make it an activity if we really want to enjoy it and get the pleasure out of it. I want to point out here that this kind of a rule they have around food, that universally they consider it rude to be eating while walking and inconsiderate and disrespectful to the food. What this can show us is that not all food rules are bad. We could very much consider this as a rule. Don't eat while you're walking, but it doesn't feel restrictive because people want to follow it. It feels supportive to them, and that's in line with their values. So I wanted to mention that because sometimes when we are recovering from disordered eating, we get in our mindset that we can't have any rules around food, and we kind of go to this other side of the spectrum. This is what happened with me, where I decided I was going to start intuitive eating and I was going to get rid of all my food rules, and I just started binge eating even more than ever. Having guidelines and rules around food is not necessarily a bad thing. It depends on what those rules are and if they're supportive to us. We usually have a rule that we don't eat moldy food, and we like that rule because that supports our health. We don't feel restricted because we think, oh, that cheese is moldy, I should just eat it anyway. No, we just don't eat it because that's a rule we like to have. So this is something that you could even consider making a food rule for yourself around. I don't walk and eat. Think about how much of the time do you spend standing and eating, where you decide, I'm just gonna have a couple almonds, and you pull out the bag and you're standing over the cabinet, and you decide, I'm gonna have a bite of cake. So you put the cake out on the countertop and you're just eating and standing with the cake. I used to do this all the time, and it was because I didn't really want to acknowledge what I was eating. I wanted to try to escape the guilt by just eating more and more as fast as possible, so I didn't have to feel ashamed that I was eating something I wasn't really hungry for. But when we can sit down and be intentional with our food, then we're actually going to get the pleasure that we're wanting out of that experience. We're probably going to actually recognize our fullness signal more, and we're going to leave feeling so much more satisfied. So the habit you can implement here is sitting down with your meals and removing your phone. Even if it's just one meal a day, being able to be present with our food helps us notice our fullness signal so much more. Because when we're distracted while eating, walking around, in our car, on the go, our brain doesn't really fully register that meal. Mindfulness at meals isn't just a wellness trend, it's truly how our digestion and satisfaction really work. So it is an important thing to implement if you're wanting to be the type of person who can be naturally thin and just eats and feels satisfied after. The last habit that Japanese people have is they walk everywhere. And this is with a lot of major cities, especially when I was traveling in places like Tokyo and Kyoto and Osaka. We also went to a small town near Mount Fuji, and they still had really good bus systems there that I was able to take, which was amazing. But of course, like anytime you're in a bigger city, they tend to have better public transit and it's more walkable. Now, this doesn't mean you need to go move to a major city, but it is something to consider of how could I build more movement into my day? If I work a desk job, can I take a walking break at lunch? Or can I take a walking break in the middle of the day? For most people, if you told your boss, hey, I really think my productivity is going to improve like tenfold and I'll come back to work so much more focused and energized if I could just take like a 20-minute walking break, they'll probably let you do that. Maybe your gym is nearby and asking yourself, could I bike to the gym? Especially as it's getting warmer, if you're listening to this in summertime right now. And I'm someone who works from home, so I like to add a morning walk-in to kind of give me that feel of a commute. I do my 20-minute morning walk around my neighborhood, and that makes me like start my work day. It's my commute to work. And sometimes I'll do that at the end of the day too, but I also definitely do it at lunch. I always give myself an hour for lunch, 95% of the time. Of course, sometimes life happens, work happens, but if you can, trying to work that in to say, how can I make more movement happen here? Now, what I want to wrap up with is an important point here, that even with all of this amazing stuff said, you could still eat unhealthy in Japan. There is still food there that doesn't make you feel good. There are still sugary desserts. Their desserts are a lot less sugary. That's like another point that I can make, is their sugar consumption is much lower, and it's because they don't eat as much sugar because there's not as much sugar added to their foods. Whereas here, sugar is added into absolutely anything and everything, from our ketchup to our pasta sauces to our frozen meals. You know, it's everywhere. And when they're having less sugar, their taste buds are rewired. So they don't crave the sweet things as much, because the more sweets we eat, the more we want of it, especially the processed sugar. This isn't the same thing with fruit, but there is still sugar that exists in their society, and there are still ways that they could get diabetes, gain weight, not feel good. They also had fried food still. So these more convenient stores, even though they were much higher ingredients and much fresher, you could still have fried chicken there. And fried chicken was actually a big popular food in Japan. Fried chicken doesn't always make you feel your best as opposed to grilled chicken, but they have it a lot less. And again, it's higher quality ingredients, but it's still important to know that processed food and convenience food has still entered Japanese culture to some degree, and that does create more negative health outcomes. I remember one day I had this matcha cheesecake in between lunch and dinner, and typically if I were to do something like that, I would try to have some protein with it, have a little meat stick or something, just to keep my blood sugar more steady, but I didn't. I had my cheesecake, and I remember I had this major blood sugar crash and felt so hangry before dinner. I was so tired. I felt mad at the world, very anxious. It was like a 5-year-old about to throw a fit. And I know this is how sugar makes me feel, which is why I typically don't consume it at all at home, or very rarely, but I had some of it there, and that just showed me this experience that even though their food was a lot healthier and it was a lot easier to be, but it really showed me that even though it was a healthier culture there and it was much easier to eat foods that were lower in sugar, you can still eat a cheesecake and not feel great. So I just want you to have the takeaway that moving somewhere abroad isn't necessarily the end all be all solution. There's still challenges there. I have an episode that I'll put on the show notes where I interviewed my friend's sister who studied food culture in Italy, and she's also part Italian herself. And that episode was really insightful to see what Italians do right, which they do a lot right. And we can see in their culture too, they eat lots of pasta and bread, and look, they still have very low obesity rates. But one thing that she mentioned that really stuck with me is how smoking is still a big part of their culture, and smoking dilutes your hunger. It makes you so you don't really feel as hungry as much throughout the day. There's also still still a lot of diet culture in Italy and a lot of pressure to be thin, especially in big cities like Milan that are very fashion centric. So even you can go move to Italy and there's still these other social pressures and ways that their society isn't healthy in other ways. Ultimately, Japan reminded me that food is never supposed to be this hard. And if you've been making it hard on yourself for a long time, that's not a personal failure. That's just what happens when we grow up in a food environment that was never designed with our well-being in mind. That's exactly why doing this work matters so much and why healing your relationship with food and prioritizing your health is very important work to do, because the US is not going to do it for you. I can tell you that. The US and other modern countries do not support our health in a very useful way. I know it can feel discouraging to live in a country like the United States that doesn't always have our best health interests in mind, but culture is the accumulation of people's choices and actions. You are a part of culture, and when you make a change, even if it's just with you, it does make a ripple effect out. You deciding to purchase real foods and cooking them at home, or biking to work, going for a walk, those changes will ripple out to your family and friends, and that is you changing culture in a positive way.